Hey, what's up? This is Nick with Notetracks, back with another episode of Behind the Track, where we deep dive into popular songs, podcasts, and videos just to try and understand what makes them great. Today, we're listening to an episode of the Buzzsprout Buzzcast podcast to try and understand why their show is just so compelling and keeps people coming back each and every week to take a listen. From the dynamic of the hosts, the topics that they cover, to the sound quality of everybody on the show, all of that we'll be going over today. We'll be using Notetracks to dissect this episode, as I know we have some users who like to take notes on the podcast that they listen to be able to come back later and see what they learned. I've already got episode 54 of the Buzzcast show pulled in here. This episode is called Create Premium Content in Apple Podcasts and How to Grow a Niche Audience. I'll, of course, leave a link in the post. I won't play the entire show, obviously, because of time. This is kind of a long episode. I think it's 45 minutes or so there. So obviously won't play the entire thing, but I am going to play some small points here and there just to highlight what we're talking about for reference. So some of the best things about this episode happen right here at the very beginning. So let's get started and jump into it.
And then Luminary, like you mentioned, apparently they have award-winning originals. I don't know what awards they won.
They won like 2 different JD Power awards or something.
What, for like best long-term consumer value in a truck? Is that what they, is that the JD Power award they won? So today,
all right. So I'm just going to pause there. There's a lot to dissect right here at the beginning of the episode. So the first thing I noticed that I love about this, that I wish more podcasters do, is they just jump right into the conversation. So jump right into conversation. And what I mean by that is there's no intro music. There's no, hey, how's it going? Welcome to the podcast. You jump in mid-conversation with the hosts. And I think that that's a super kind of sticky technique that marketers and podcasters can use. Just hook your listeners mid-conversation. Just start your episode with something that's engaging, or the tail end of something that you were just talking about. Cut it there and just jump right into the episode. As a listener, I find it really compelling because I have a lot of questions. You know, what are they talking about? What am I missing? What do I know? What do I not know? How can I contextualize this into listening to this podcast that I'm familiar with? What the heck is even going on in my ears? So I love this. Just jump right into the conversation. Obviously, they don't go on too long with this technique. It looks like it's just about 10, 15 seconds, but I think it's a great way to start a podcast. Just rip off the Band-Aid and start. And then something else that we heard here, I'll play it again, is this transition music. Let's listen to it.
award they won.
So that short little piece of music is going to be a recurring theme throughout this episode and throughout other Buzzcast episodes as just an audio stinger is what it's called. And I think transition music is super awesome for people who are just getting started with podcasting, and even the top end super professional podcasts. I know that some of the podcasters that made a name for themselves kind of in the early days of podcasting and even today are known for those big, long, 2-3 hour long interview formats, and there's no cuts and there's no breaks. They might go to the bathroom and they'll just splice the audio together. But other than that, there's no hard cuts in the episode. Whereas in this particular episode, Buzzsprout is trying to deliver as much value as they can in as little time as they can. And so using transitions allows them to kind of jump between sections in the episode without it feeling like a big jump cut. They put that audio cue in there to let listeners know, hey, a transition is coming, or a transition is happening. There's a new section coming. Be prepared for it and jump right into it. So I think transitions are super underrated in the podcast space. Don't be afraid to use them. Get an audio brand that fits in with the message of your podcast, feels like a cool part of the show, and don't be afraid to use it to just cut sections together. So this is the first of a couple transitions. I'll play some of the other ones later in the episode so you can hear kind of how they get incorporated again. But yeah, first one, just a couple seconds into the episode, and I really like it. What we're about to listen to now, I won't play the whole thing just because it's a little bit long, but is an overview of the episode. So what I mean by an overview is they tell you exactly what you're going to listen to in this episode. They don't beat around the bush. Here within the first 30 seconds, you're already into the part of the conversation where they tell you exactly what you're going to learn, what to pay attention to, who this podcast is for, all that great meat and potatoes of the episode without boring listeners with a 10-minute intro or anything. again, they cut straight to the chase. So let's hear a little bit of this overview before we get into the actual topic of the podcast.
Today on Buzzcast, we're going to talk about the new Apple Podcast subscriptions finally rolling out and being available, how to take advantage of it, some strategies on how to use them effectively for your show. We're going to dive into some affiliate marketing strategies and tactics. We're going to talk about growing your podcast, all that jazz. But first of all, Jordan.
So as you can hear, just a quick summary of what's to come in the episode before they start jumping into talking to hosts. Just one host. Here's what we're going to hear. Yeah, I really love that. I think more podcasters should incorporate an overview. Just like if you're writing an article, what are you about to read? What's coming up, you know? All right, so that kind of goes on for a little while. So this is part of the overview. I won't bore you with the whole podcast. I implore you to please listen to the whole episode. I think there's a lot of great advice and value in there. But this first couple of minutes is just the hosts going back and forth, picking stuff apart, talking about what they're going to talk about on their show, what they've been up to, that sort of thing. So just getting off the ground. It's not super serious. They're not really into what the show is about yet, but they've told you what to expect, and now we're into kind of like a late night show. You know, the monologue that kicks off the late night show. That's kind of what's going on here. So I'm going to fast forward just a little bit. We're going to jump into the second transition of the show. Here, let me just leave a note here. We jump right into overview of the show. Great 30 seconds of what you're going to talk about. Cool. So that kind of takes up, this whole section here. So don't be afraid to banter with a monologue or having a laugh after we've got the business taken care of. Get that up out front right away. Okay, so the next thing we're going to listen to is another transition. So we're coming out of the fun of the intro, and we're actually getting into the point of the show. So I'm going to play towards the end of this intro, and you're going to hear how that transition music creeps back up again and rolls us into the main event of this podcast.
Like, people are just like, this is kind of a weird intro, and then just moving on. So I don't think...
Just a guy with like split personality disorder hosting a podcast.
All right, so now let's jump.
And that's it. The piece of conversation ends. There's a little bit of transition music that the editing team threw in there after the fact. Absolutely love that. And then we're here into what you're here to listen to. This is the main event in the podcast. So I'm just going to play a small section of this and then talk about why it's significant.
Into Apple Podcasts premium content. It was promised back in April. They said this epic thing is coming. You're going to be able to make money from your podcast in Apple Podcasts. And
So as you can hear there, here on the Buzzcast podcast, they're talking about this new premium podcast subscription option that is available inside of Apple Podcasts. It's something that they've been talking about for a little while. It's finally here. It's a great step forward for some podcasters looking to move up to that premium level with some of their fans. So it's a great topic for a podcast. Again, I implore you to listen to this episode and get all of the juice out of there. But simply put, this part of the podcast is just a news item. So depending on your industry and depending on the niche that you're working in, you can use a similar technique as the Buzzsprout folks here, where they're taking things that are happening within the community that they're servicing and talking about them with experts in a panel format. So there's 3 hosts on this show, which we'll hear momentarily. There's 3 separate hosts. And they kind of go round table sharing some of the thoughts that they have around this news, what they think it could mean, how they're implementing it in their own life, just really riffing off of this news item. And I've heard from some beginner podcasters, sometimes it's hard to find things to talk about. How are you going to keep listeners engaged? Well, honestly, one of the best ways to keep listeners engaged is to keep up with the news. So keep up with the news items related to your niche. You don't have to reinvent the wheel with your podcast here. Obviously, this is a podcast about podcasting, so it's a little meta, but they're still able to pull some podcasting news that's relevant to the community and break that down here on the episode and talk about it. So I'm just going to jump here to a middle section. We're going to hear some of the dialogue between the hosts, seeing how they play off of each other. But the bulk of the episode really here makes up this news item. We're talking about Apple Podcasts and premium subscriptions, and then talking about how to implement it. So I'm just going to pick a random spot here and hit play, and you'll hear the dynamic between some of the hosts.
This episode. But then these two, I guess the Strawberry Thief and the Dragon of the North, are these some of your bonus episodes right here?
Yes, those are subscription only episodes.
Okay, so can we click on one to see what happens?
Yeah, so if we go to Strawberry Thief, then we get this screen that says we need to play with a free trial.
So as you can hear in real time, the hosts of this episode are going back and forth with each other, kind of exploring this new feature that Apple has. They're experiencing it in real time, sharing with their listeners probably some of the same concerns and questions that you have while you're listening to the episode. So if you're going to cover a news item, really just jump into it live, experience it for the first time. It doesn't necessarily even have to be polished. You don't have to know exactly what you're going to talk about that news item. If you're relying on editing after the fact, you can go back and curate some of the conversation a little bit better. But I feel like the humanness of this part of the conversation, just three friends talking to each other, sharing knowledge, is a really cool format. So three friends sharing knowledge. And obviously, you're going to be able to adapt some of these tips and tricks depending on your own podcast format to try and improve your show. You don't necessarily have to have three hosts on the show. If you're just a one woman podcast, you can still react to the news. You can still integrate some of these techniques. So the bulk of the episode, as I said, is here in this big middle section. So I'll kind of showcase this here just by highlighting a good chunk of the episode. I think we brought it out there. Yeah, good guess. So bulk of the episode is news item. Okay, so the reason that's significant, I obviously selected here about 20 minutes of the episode. So if you can see here visually how this episode is structured, we have a little chunk of time here for the introduction, and then we move here into an elongated section that is dedicated to the point of the episode. And they're not shying away from spending a lot of time talking about it. I love that. Don't be afraid to deep dive into something if you think that it can bring value to your listeners. But it does come to an end. This section does not run on forever. And that's really important because I think that the pacing of this show overall is really engaging. It's almost structured like a sitcom is, or a late night show where you have an intro monologue. You spend some time doing things internally, with cast members that are on the show, doing sketches, doing things that you have control over right up front here at the beginning of the show, and then transitioning into what is, I think, my favorite part of this whole experience, and I think a lot more people could benefit implementing something similar into their own show, is getting into a section around user questions. So again, if you're looking for thoughts and ideas, how do you spice up your own podcast? Reach out to your audience. I think this is an amazing tool to be able to create content for your podcast. Ask your listeners what's on their mind. What do they have questions about? What do they need help with? And answer them on the show. So let's just take a listen to the transition here into the user section or user question section portion of this podcast.
Podcast community over on Facebook. So we've got some questions queued up here for us to talk through. And the first one that I thought would be really great to tackle has to do with affiliate marketing. And it's very simple. It's from Silas, and he just says, affiliate marketing would be great. So Alvin, I know that you work a lot in the affiliate marketing.
So yeah, transitioning back into using the hosts of this show and the guests of this show to propel the content forward. The question gets passed off to Alvin there, who has some firsthand experience answering this user question. The second thing that I want to draw attention to, not only do I think user questions is a great way to build out content for your podcast from your listeners, or even from going to Reddit posts or something and seeing what the top topics of the day or of the week are in your niche and addressing them on your podcast. Something else that happens, it's a little subtle. Let me see if I can back up and play it again.
Until someone buys from you, that makes a lot more sense from a starting off point.
Here here we go.
So other than Apple, which was definitely the big news of the week, we also wanted to do something we haven't done in a little bit, which is just ask for questions from our awesome podcast community over on Facebook.
There it is, right there. Awesome podcast community over on Facebook. Buzzsprout has done an amazing job of building a community of followers and listeners, not just on the podcast itself. They've built a community on other platforms. And as a marketer, I think it's really important that you don't focus all of your attention just on one platform. Diversify, right? You got to diversify the things that you're doing. And having a community hub place on Facebook, or maybe even an email newsletter that you can have people engaged in outside of just listening to the podcast, is a great way to expand your audience and expand the reach of your community. Your community is what's going to drive your podcast forward and help you build an audience on it. And if you're able to support your community by directly asking them for questions and for content for the show, they're going to feel involved. They're going to feel an emotional attachment to your show. So this is kind of subtle. They only mention it just for a second here, but this shout out outside of the Buzzsprout ecosystem, I think, is a great touch for keeping that community building alive. So let's just jump into this section here so we can take a listen to some of the answers to the user questions. You'll hear some more banter from our hosts. And then there's one more topic, or excuse me, two more topics after we're done listening here to the user question portion that I want to draw attention to.
And I know that you do sponsors. Have you done affiliate marketing as well? And how do you think about those two and the strengths and weaknesses of each of them? Because I know these are two different strategies that people often conflate, and they think affiliate marketing is the same as brand sponsorships.
Affiliate marketing is when someone uses your link or uses your code and you get compensated.
So again, you can hear there that the hosts are bouncing back and forth. They're the experts in the field of podcasting, and they're bouncing back and forth to answer these user questions that have come in on the Facebook community, which I think is super cool. So I'm going to highlight just this big bulk section here to show, again, this is another basically chapter of the show. We've got user questions fielded from a community. So it's outside of just their webpage. They're saying, go to our Facebook community, specifically our Facebook group where there's other like-minded podcasters, and leave your questions there. So even if you don't have that community built yet, you can start a community, obviously, and use your podcast to promote it and encourage people to go elsewhere, follow you elsewhere, and share their thoughts and feedback with you over there. So user questions fielded from a community, Facebook group, could be a Reddit thread just to get things going. Ask questions on Reddit and get some answers there. Could be a newsletter, etc. Anywhere outside of your podcast that you're looking to get feedback. All right, something that happens inside of this conversation, I'm going to try and find the section here for it, is a tip that I think can benefit a lot of people, not just in the podcasting space, but I just say life in general. And that is to try and find ways to make the advice that you're giving applicable to all of the listeners on the show. Because obviously the Buzzcast podcast has people all across the spectrum, people who haven't even uploaded their first episode of anything yet. They just have an idea to start a podcast, all the way up to people who are syndicated and have hundreds of episodes online distributed for years. So they're trying to cover a very wide audience. And so when they're talking about one of these topics here in the user question section, they do make a point. It's really, really awesome. They do make a point to try and provide value to everybody on that spectrum. They say, here's how this advice is applicable to you if you're just getting started. Here's your advice if you're farther along in the journey, and everybody in between. They try to repurpose some of that information. So let's take a listen.
So the audience for true crime, I remember meeting somebody at a conference and she said, I'm really not sure if I'm doing well. I'm only getting 20, maybe 30,000 plays per episode. And we're like, whoa, that's really good. How long have you been podcasting? She goes, oh, that's good. That's awesome. Yeah, I've put out, I think, 4 episodes already. And everyone around her was like, what? How are these numbers like possible? And she had, I think she had like years of like true crime. Like she actually worked solving cold cases or something. And each episode was about a specific cold case she'd solved. And the audience for that is massive. And then we've met people who said podcasting is the very best marketing I've ever done for my small business, and they're only getting 150 plays per episode.
So you can hear there, taking this story that came from either personal experience or from a user here about comparing download numbers on your podcast. Obviously, some people get lucky right out the gate and they get thousands of listeners and thousands of downloads right up front. And it's amazing. And they have a great time producing the podcast. And then if you're like the rest of us, most of us, it takes time, right, to build up an audience and market your podcast effectively. So I think the host did a great job here, making sure to pivot not just away from the story back into the conversation, but say, this is a story that happened, but let's break down why it happened that way. Like, is it the niche of the podcast? Is it something that they're doing for the marketing? Is it that if you have a small business, then you can expect your listener numbers to be different, right? They're trying to repurpose this story, this anecdote into a couple different camps so that no matter who is listening, they can contextualize that information for their own podcast, which I think is subtle, but is something that I think can really amplify the value that your podcast brings. And like I said, I think it's just a good life tip, right? Make sure that what you're saying provides value for as many people as possible. All right, so we're wrapping things up now, and I want to play the ending of this podcast, because I think the outro of this podcast is super succinct and it gives a very clear call to action. We had a mention about this Facebook community earlier in the episode, right? Right in the middle between the two big sections that people are here to listen to. They're bound to hear it. Normally there might be an ad break there or something, but there's a mention of the community, a clear call to action. Go here, do this thing if you're a fan of the show. So we're going to hear at the end of the podcast, they're bringing things again full circle back to that CTA, the call to action that they want people to take. So let's hear that.
So maybe not every single email, but quite, to hands
Into the podcast version of Buzzcast, just go find podcasting Q&A. Yes, all of those are great tips. I didn't even have to weigh in. I got to be Kevin for this segment, just not say anything. If you want to learn more marketing promotion strategies to help grow your audience, we're actually in the middle of a 12-part podcast marketing series over on Podcasting Q&A. So if you listen to the podcast version of Buzzcast, just go find Podcasting Q&A inside of our Buzzsprout channel if you happen to listen on Apple Podcasts. Or if you're here on YouTube, the next video will drop on Monday here on the channel. So you just stay subscribed and you'll continue to get awesome podcast marketing goodness. Well, Jordan, do you want to do the honor of taking us out with our outro?
Absolutely. So if you are not already a member, join the Facebook Buzzsprout podcast community. We're always looking for people.
Right. Tons and tons of stuff in there. Super great. They've got a 12-week course. They're plugging the Facebook community again. Use your outro for good. Use your outro for good. Right? Not evil. Duh. Plug your Facebook community. Tell people about courses that you have coming on, webinars that you've got coming up. Maybe you're doing a Facebook Live or an Instagram Live covering certain topics. Again, try and migrate people just off of the podcast listening app that they're in and try and encourage them to interact in other ways, even if they're just small, sending in a tweet or an email with a question or comment that they have about something that they heard on the show, using this outro with a clear call to action here in 2K. In this case, there's two call to actions. One is, hey, check out this course that we're doing at the moment, this 12-week offering. And go check out our Facebook community, which we had heard about earlier. I see too many podcasts waste an opportunity right here at the end, just as people are winding down or the conversation is ending, to not tell people what to do. People want to support you. They want to buy a shirt. They want to listen to you more. They want to support and make sure that your podcast stays around. So give them a way to do that. Show people how they can support you. So use your outro for good. Show people how they can support you. Communities, email, newsletter, merch, anything you got that you feel like is a good CTA. And I think I forgot a comment here. Whoops. Put in here, keep your advice broad and general. Sure, you're hitting a lot of your listeners. Cool. Well, I think that's it. Again, I encourage all of you to go and listen to this full episode. There's obviously some great things here between the markers and the bumpers that I didn't get to cover today that Buzzcast talks about much more eloquently than I can. But I hope that this has been insightful for some of you podcasters out there looking to take your marketing to the next level, figure out your show format. These are some of my favorite things that Buzzcast and the Buzzsprout team are doing with the show that I think set it apart and obviously keep people coming back for more. If you have an episode of a podcast that you would like us to break down on Behind the Track, or even a song or video that you would like us to try and figure out what makes it tick and what makes it popular and successful, we're happy to break it down. Be sure to leave a comment down below, or of course, send it to us via email. You can hit me up at nick@notetracks.com. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.